Evening, everybody. Good to see you all. Last week, seems like a long time ago, Nick did a sermon on, I really appreciated it. He talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and he took that and he showed how relevant that is to MCC. If you didn't see it, if you weren't here, then go back and have a look at that. That's really cool. What kind of news-worthy week is this? 2 engagements. That's amazing. Very excited. It's also the first Sunday of Lent, which is why we're purple tonight. I guess that could be confusing in a church like ours, but the purple is to do with Lent. It's a royal colour. Who grew up in a church that emphasised Lent? Yeah, these are probably all of our Anglicans, Catholics, Lutherans. Yeah. Lots of churches don't really have an emphasis on Lent. And MCC, I guess, is maybe somewhere in the middle. But the 40 days of leading up to Easter is this Lent season. And so what I want to do tonight is I want to finish off our rewilding series and begin a Lent series all in one. So, to sum up our rewilding series, just in case you've missed bits of it, we've been considering how the environmental concept of rewilding, basically getting out of the way and letting nature take its course, how that can be applied to the church. And I've been sharing some ideas from Steve Eisthorpe's book, Rewilding the Church. And his idea is that instead of trying to organise things into being, we should just stand back and pay attention to what's emerging in our church and throw some manure at that. And there are some wonderful things emerging in our church, I think. We also asked the question in our Rewilding series of who we are and why are we here. Remember that rabbi and the centurion? So who are we and why are we here? And we talked about what the answer to that is individually, and also what the answer to that is as a congregation. Because the answer to that helps us recognise when our congregation is thriving and healthy. We kind of know what that looks like. And then I talked about invasive species, things that destroy life in churches instead of letting it thrive. And I mentioned 2 things in particular. One is the danger of frenetic activity, and particularly around volunteering. And then the other was mishandled conflict, something that every church I've ever been involved in seems to find it really difficult to handle conflict, which is why we really want to do that Ways of Working Together workshop next week, so another plug for that. I wanted to just make one last point on rewilding before we move into Lent, and that is the idea of reintroducing a key species. And the best way to describe this is to tell you what happened at Yellowstone National Park in the late 90s and early thousands, and I can see early 2000s, and I can see a couple of people nodding. I bet you've seen the YouTube video. It was a bit of a controversial move, but they decided to reintroduce a small number of wolves into Yellowstone National Park in 1995. They'd been exterminated from the park since the 1920s, and in that time the number of deer had exploded because, of course, there were few natural predators. And in spite of culling programs, the deer had just overgrazed the park so that there was hardly any vegetation left. They nibble it right to the very ground. Now, when the wolves were reintroduced, of course, they killed some of the deer. But much more significantly, the behaviour of the deer changed dramatically. They began to avoid places where they could get trapped. places like gorges and riversides, and very quickly vegetation returned to those areas. Some trees grew 5 times as high as they had done when the deer were there. And that's because the tops of them weren't constantly getting eaten, and so they got a chance to grow. And that meant that forests became established, which meant that birds returned to the area. The number of beavers also increased because, of course, beavers really like eating trees. And beavers built dams. And those dams provided safe habitat for muskrats and otters and fish and ducks and lizards. The wolves also killed the coyotes, and that meant that the rabbit and mouse population increased because the coyotes were the natural predators for them. And because of that, lots more rabbits and mice, well, the hawks returned to the area. And foxes and weasels and badgers also returned because they're also natural predators to rabbits and mice. The number of bears also rose to feed on the carrion that the wolves were leaving, and also because now there were more berries to eat from these really big trees. The new forests stabilised the banks of the rivers so that the banks stopped collapsing all the time and the rivers became much more fixed in their paths. The forests meant less erosion. So a handful of wolves changed the geography of this whole national park. Eisthorpe makes a controversial suggestion that maybe Jesus is a key species who needs to be reintroduced. Now, he's quick to add that it's not like Jesus has been absent from the church, but it's true, we can lose sight of Jesus, even though he's the foundation of the Christian faith. Jesus, the head of the body, the true human, the one that a human being really looks like, the one who embodied God, the Christ, the one that some people were strangely drawn to, especially those who were the least in their society. Jesus, also the one that some were vehemently opposed to, who raised hackles, who raised eyebrows, who sometimes raised merry hell. The one that the church of the day threw out, spurned, rejected, marginalised, mostly because of the company that he kept and because of the way he interpreted the scriptures. I kind of feel like Jesus would make a good ally, wouldn't he, for MCC? But don't think that he's the sort of ally who just nods and smiles and says empathetic things, because as C.S. Lewis says, he's not a tame lion. Just like the wolves at Yellowstone, Jesus is the great disruptor. He disrupted the status quo. He disrupted authority structures. He disrupted religious practices, disrupted the lives of those who had given up, and also disrupted the lives of those who thought that they were doing quite well. So this Lent, we're going to focus on Jesus, the great disruptor. And we're going to meet Jesus through the eyes of people who met him, starting with Simeon, who met Jesus before Jesus was even 6 weeks old. Thanks, Ruth.
Tonight's reading comes from Luke chapter 2, verses 25 to 35. Now, there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon, who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel." The child's father and mother marvelled at what was said about him. Then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too."
You know, a century before Jesus was born, the Jewish nation had just devolved into this chaotic political and religious mess. It was polarised into two opposing political factions who had very different views on the way that the nation should head in. One faction wanted to resist the pull to integrate with the surrounding culture and stay separate from the other people groups. The other faction thought that the nation was never going to move forward unless they opened themselves up to other cultures and interacted more with the people groups around them and of other cultures. It kind of sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? History just goes round and round and round. Anyway, it got violent. And one of the groups appealed to the strong kid on the block, which happened to be the Roman Empire. So the Roman general Pompey was very happy to oblige. "Sure, I'll come and help. I'll bring peace." And so in 63 BCE, Pompey laid siege to Jerusalem. When Pompey arrived, he surveyed the city to decide how best to defeat it. And we actually have the words of a Jewish historian named Josephus that he wrote around that time, and he tells us what Pompey saw. He said, this is Josephus, "For Pompey saw the walls around Jerusalem were so firm it would be hard to overcome them, and that the valley before the walls was terrible, and that the temple which was within that valley was itself encompassed by a very strong wall, insomuch that if the city was taken, the temple would be a second place of refuge for the enemy to retire to." Well, Pompey was right. Jerusalem's a really hard city to defeat. But his soldiers managed, actually with the help of some Jewish people who wanted the Romans to come in, they managed to take the northwest region of Jerusalem, including the royal palace. And the people of Jerusalem retreated to the temple courts because, as Josephus noted, there was a strong wall around the temple. They destroyed the bridge that spanned the distance between the temple and the rest of the city, so that Pompey's soldiers couldn't get to the temple. And there they stayed. According to Josephus, they stayed for 3 months there. All of these residents of Jerusalem, eating, sleeping, living in the temple courts and surrounding area. There's nowhere else to go, no way to escape. And Pompey's troops slowly filled the ditch at the northern end of the city, bit by bit, until it was high enough to build some siege towers against the wall, and then they brought in battering rams. And after 3 months of hard work, the army managed to breach the walls surrounding the temple, and centurions in their battle armour clambered over and they poured into the temple courts. Josephus records, admittedly, he does have a bit of a tendency to exaggerate. Nonetheless, he records that 12,000 Jews were slaughtered that day and in the following few days. They were slaughtered in the temple courts. A few Roman soldiers died, as you can imagine, with all of their armour. From that day onwards, Jerusalem, broken and battered, lived under the rule of the Roman Empire. This is the time of when Jesus was born. And I got to thinking, if, as most historians believe, Jesus was born around 4 BC, long story, then Simeon would have been alive during that siege, probably a young boy. And it makes me wonder whether he was there, if he lived through that 3-month siege and the final terrible days of slaughter. I wonder if his parents were there, or his siblings, or his friends maybe. He surely would have known people who died in those terrible days. And I wondered what life was like for Simeon growing up under the shadow of this powerful Roman Empire who kept peace through fear and brute force. We're told that Simeon was a good man. He was devout. He had a fierce loyalty to his God. And he'd been waiting expectantly, Luke tells us, all his life for the consolation of Israel, because God had revealed to him that Simeon wouldn't die until he'd seen the one who was going to bring that consolation about, or the restoration maybe of Israel. He wouldn't die until he'd seen the one appointed to be Israel's king. Well, Simeon had a strange prompting one day to go to the temple. And on that very day, Mary and Joseph go to the temple for a Jewish purification ritual. And they take Jesus with them. He's about 6 weeks old, still a tiny newborn. And by divine appointment, this holy coincidence, Simeon and the little family meet at the temple. This is the spot that Pompey and his centurions had slaughtered so many people. When Simeon sees Jesus, he takes this baby in his arms, looks at him and says to God, "I can die in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation." Now, what did Simeon mean by salvation? Can be translated liberation or deliverance or rescue. What was Simeon hoping for when he looked into the face of Jesus and said, "This is the one. This is the one who'll bring salvation"? Because when Simeon said Jesus is salvation, I don't think he meant, "Oh good, I get to go to heaven when I die." I don't think so. I think that maybe Simeon had in mind those long, long years of oppression that he had lived through under Roman rule. And maybe he was remembering all of those people who'd died. And he sees in Jesus the end of that enemy occupation. Salvation for Simeon is not just about him, it's about his people, it's about the whole nation. And I suspect that Simeon probably thought that salvation for his people would come through force, because how else was this going to work? It would come through the sword, wielded by this one, wielded by Jesus and perhaps an army by that point. And Simeon left the temple that day in peace. We never hear about him again. We can only assume that this aged man died shortly afterwards, as he was expecting to, no longer in despair about what was going to happen to his nation, but utterly confident that he had seen salvation and the one who would bring about it. So he died in hope that this baby would liberate his people. He died, I guess, never knowing that Jesus didn't even gather an army. He died about 30 years before the Romans arrested Jesus and executed him. So salvation, whatever it wasn't what Simeon was expecting. And did you hear the note of foreboding, though, in what Simeon said directly to Mary? A sword will pierce your own soul. The word for sword is a large, broad sword, a Roman sword. How is this salvation? An innocent scapegoat nailed to a Roman cross. A devastated mother weeping as she looks on, a metaphorical Roman sword piercing her heart. Simeon also said, this one, as he looks at the infant, is going to be the cause of the falling and rising of many. I dare say that he thought it was the Romans who were going to be falling and his own people who were going to be doing the rising up against them. But that's not how the story that Luke tells unfolds. Instead of gathering an army and marching on the Roman garrison at Jerusalem, Jesus goes to parties with pretty dubious guest lists, to be honest. Heals a bunch of people, none of them who have any political sway, any political influence. People like lepers and slaves, women with abnormal uterine bleeding. He cuddles babies, blesses them. Tells a rich donor that if you want to join my group, you're going to need to give away all your assets first. Don't want them. He seems more interested in people at the bottom of society than people at the top, people with power. I wonder if Simeon was still alive, whether he thought maybe he heard God wrong. Maybe he'd made a terrible, terrible mistake, prophesying that this infant was salvation. But there's some really interesting language at the other end of the story. From when Simeon gazed on Jesus, in that scene at the Roman cross, there are also people who gaze upon Jesus. And they use the language of salvation too. 3 times in a few short verses, 3 times, one after another, 3 groups of people tell Jesus to save himself. The people who had come to ridicule Jesus, crowds of people, with their leaders egging them on, said, why doesn't he save himself if he's the king, the Christ, the chosen one of God? The soldiers, the centurions, said something similar. Well, if you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. And even a criminal dying beside him mocked Jesus, saying, I thought you were the Christ. Save yourself and us. 3 times, 3 groups of people in about 5 verses. Luke is known for using irony in his storytelling. I love irony in storytelling. The irony is that Jesus' way of salvation doesn't involve him saving himself. Jesus knows that if he saves himself, he can't save others. Jesus brings salvation without wielding a sword. It's by refusing, in fact, to pick up a sword that Jesus saves people. Salvation comes through gazing at Jesus. Jesus in Simeon's arms, Jesus nailed to a cross. Isn't that a paradox? The word that Simeon uses when he looks at Jesus and says, my eyes have seen your salvation, it can mean both salvation and the means of achieving it. So it can mean salvation and saviour, deliverance and deliverer. It can mean liberation and liberator. What if gazing at Jesus is not only the way to salvation, but it's also the way of salvation, the way to freedom and the way of freedom, the outcome and the method. Freedom and also the way to get there. Not just our individual salvation, but salvation for our whole global community. A liberation that doesn't come through violence, but through grace, through welcome, through acceptance, through love of both neighbour and enemy alike. When we gaze at Jesus, what is it that we see in him that could save the world? What do you think salvation means? What does salvation mean for you? What do you need rescuing from? I wonder if you gaze at Jesus long enough, maybe you'll see salvation too. But like Simeon, maybe it won't look like you were expecting. But in some surprising way, in a way that causes the rising and falling of things in your life, things that you thought were so important that you've placed them up so high, placed so much importance at the very top of the priorities in your life. Maybe if you gaze at Jesus long enough, maybe those things will come tumbling down. And those things you've never paid that much attention to, that have been kind of beneath your notice, really not worthy of your time, maybe those things will begin to rise and become much more important to you. So this Lent, I think we should gaze at Jesus. We should gaze at the infant in Simeon's arms, the one who went to parties thrown by dubious people, the one who touched lepers and who let outcasts touch him, a friend of all of those who society regards as sinners, friends of sinners, and the one who brought salvation by refusing to save himself. So let's do that.